Hey everyone, welcome to Judging for the Win. I'm Dave, and this is my daily ruling. Today is this month's patron pick, and I've got a special treat for all of you. I can hardly believe it, but we're already halfway to 1,000 daily rulings. And I know that some people have probably thought, hey, I'm watching this channel every day. I wonder how my skills with rules and policy compare to a certified judge's. Or maybe you're considering becoming a certified judge, and you wanted some way to practice the level 1 exam. Well, this is your lucky day, because the topic that the patrons picked this month is for me to make an exam that mirrors as closely as I could what I would expect to see if I gave somebody a level 1 exam right now. So, before I go on, I definitely want to give a huge thank you to all of my patrons. This project took a lot of work, and I can say on a very real level, there's no way I would have done so much work if I didn't have a group of people out there supporting me and pulling for me and hoping for my projects to succeed. So from the bottom of my heart, thank you to each and every one of you. Now, before we get too deep into the questions, let's talk a little bit about the structure of the exam. So if you take the level 1 exam, this is information that's current as far as I'm aware as of right now. This could change, so anything that does change, by the way, will be in a pinned comment. So take a look at this. We've got 25 questions, and 5 of them are based on policy. The rest of the 20 are based on rules. And you've got about an hour and 20 minutes to go through all of them. It's actually split into 2 different sections, so the 1 hour for your rules questions is going to be a separate bank than the 20 minutes for your policy questions. The test is provided online, and it's also provided open documents, which means that it's perfectly okay for you to get the CR out and reference it while you're taking the exam. 80% is a passing score, and there's one more very important point about the exam, which is that you can do it. I have faith in all of you, and I think you probably know a lot more than you might realize. So, with all of that said, we're finally ready to get into the questions. How this is going to work is I'm going to read the question, and then I'm going to start talking about the answer, and then I'm going to reveal what the answer is. So if you want to play along at home, and I definitely recommend that because there's only one time when you can watch this video not knowing what all of the answers that I'm about to say are going to be, then pause the video after I read out every question and take some time to read through the answers and think about how you would respond. Ready? Start the clock. Alright, so for our first question, Amy casts an Annihilate against Nick's Grizzly Bears. In response, Nick is going to cast a Death Lace targeting the Grizzly Bears. What happens after the Death Lace resolves? And here's a brief aside. Anytime you see a card on screen during this presentation, that means that you can count on that card's text to be accurate. In general, of course, you would want to look up the actual Oracle text, but I'm saving everybody that step. I'll guarantee right now that the text for all of these cards is accurate in every way that will affect the answer. There might be some templating changes, such as saying remove from the game instead of exile, or maybe some of the creature types that don't matter for anything are going to be a little outdated, but you can rely on what you see on the cards to count for everything that you would need in order to answer that question. So, to start out, let's remember that we're going to cast a spell, and as part of the process for casting a spell, you have to choose targets. Now, one time when you check to see if the targets are legal is as you're casting the spell. And another time that you check to see if the targets are legal is when the spell is about to resolve. And the important rule that we need to know here is that if a spell has no legal targets when it tries to resolve, then that spell will not resolve. It'll get removed from the stack and none of its effects will happen. So that's going to correspond with answer choice E here. Now, another couple of interesting points. It certainly was legal to target the Grizzly Bears with the Annihilate during the time when we were casting the Annihilate, but when the Annihilate goes to resolve, then none of its targets are legal, so none of the effects are going to happen. Now, it is possible if a spell has more than one target that some of the targets would be legal and some of them wouldn't be. If you had a case like that, then the spell would go on to resolve and do as much as it can, only affecting the targets that remain being legal targets. Alright, so next question here is Amy casts a Jace the Mind Sculptor, and after it resolves she plays a Plains and taps the Plains for white. Then she uses the white to activate a Chromatic Sphere, and after that she uses the +2 ability of Jace. So at what point or points during this sequence could Nick cast a Lightning Bolt before Jace goes up to 5 loyalty? And you can choose all the answers that apply. Okay, so for the answer to this one, we're just going to go through step by step and make some comments about whether a player would have priority at any of those points. So the first thing to note is that Amy is the active player, which means that after the Jace resolves, she is going to be the first person to get priority. And she would, of course, use that priority to play the planes. Now, because Nick did not get priority after the Jace resolved, then that means that he does not have a chance to play the lightning bolt before Amy plays the planes, because Amy playing the planes is the game action that takes place immediately after Jace resolves. Important to note, lands do not use the stack, so that means it's not possible for Nick to respond to the planes. That is not a play that he could make either. Okay, so after the planes comes into play, but before Amy activates the Chromatic Sphere, well, it turns out that tapping the planes for white is a mana ability. And mana abilities also do not use the stack. That's one of the things that's special about mana abilities. So because it does not use the stack, it's also not possible to respond to tapping the planes for white. Chromatic Sphere also has a mana ability, which means that it is not possible to respond to that either. So that means that answer choice C is likewise going to be eliminated. And as far as answer choice D goes, there is no opportunity to cast a spell in between the time when you say that you are doing the +2 ability of Jace, but before the 2 counters actually gets put on Jace. And so the reason for that would be because the putting 2 counters on Jace is actually a cost to activate that ability. And because of that being the case, it's not possible to cast a spell when you're in the middle of casting another spell or activating an ability. So we end up with the answer E. It is not possible for Nick to cast Lightning Bolt at any point before the Jace has 5 loyalty counters on it, which is kind of an interesting point and very important to know because this sort of thing does come up in formats where Jace is played. All right, so for the next question here, Amy attacks with a Wind Drake, and Nick blocks with a Phantom Monster. Then Amy plays a Canopy Claws targeting the Phantom Monster. What happens in the combat damage step? Okay, so in order to answer this question, we're going to need to know a little fact about how combat works, which is that the set of blocks that you propose is evaluated to see whether it is a legal set of blocks at one specific time. And that one specific time is during the point in the game where you're declaring those blocks. So there's a whole set of steps that you have to go through in order to officially declare blockers. And once you go through all those steps, your blockers are set. And if you're able to successfully go through all of them, then that's what your blockers are. The game isn't going to back up to correct a block that becomes illegal due to something else happening in the game. So it turns out that the answer to this is A. The combat proceeds entirely normally and nothing unusual happens. The Wind Drake and the Phantom Monster proceed to deal damage to each other just like they normally would. So, next question. Okay, Amy casts a Fists of the Anvil on Elvish Warrior. Nick responds by casting Twisted Image on the Elvish Warrior. After those resolve, Nick activates Serendib Sorcerer's ability targeting Elvish Warrior. What is the power and toughness after that ability resolves, but before state-based actions are performed? Okay, so the important thing to know about this question would be the fact that all of the continuous effects that are acting on the Elvish Warrior are specific types of continuous effects. And that means that they take place in specific layers. Now, the way that continuous effects work in Magic is that continuous effects of one sort get put into one type of layer, and continuous effects that do other kinds of things get put into other layers. And the layer system exists to make it so that if you have a bunch of continuous effects that are all going on, then they always apply in layer order, that is, based on what the continuous effects do, rather than based off of, for example, timestamp order, like when they started. So, in that case, you would need to know that abilities that set the base power and toughness of a creature, such as Serendib Sorcerer, those apply in the earliest layer out of the 3 types of continuous effects that we have going on. Effects that give +X+X or -X-X, those go next, and then switching happens at the very end. So that means that the appropriate order to apply these 3 continuous effects in would be Serendib Sorcerer first, and then Fist of the Anvil, and then Twisted Image. So our Elvish Warrior is going to start out being a 2-3, and then it's going to go being a 0-2, and then a 4-2, and then finally it'll end up being a 2-4. Alright, next question. Amy attacks with Fangren Hunter, and Nick blocks with 2 Grizzly Bears. Amy casts a Coat with Venom, targeting the Fangren Hunter. Which of the following are legal possibilities for Amy to assign Fangren Hunter's combat damage? Choose all that apply. So, the Fangren Hunter will have 5 power, and it will have Trample and Death Touch when this damage is happening. With that being the case, the important things to note for this question are that A, Trample says that any excess damage after you've assigned lethal damage to all of the creatures can be assigned to the defending player. And when the game is calculating excess damage, it does know that Death Touch is a thing. So that means that 1 damage from the Fangren Hunter is enough to be considered lethal damage to any of the Grizzly Bears. The same thing goes for if you have a double block situation, you have to assign lethal damage to the first creature in the combat damage assignment order before you can assign any damage to the next creature in the damage assignment order. And finally, Trample is optional. So that means that it is totally legal for you to assign extra damage beyond what lethal damage would be to any of the creatures. So with that being the case, it is possible to assign damage in any of these 3 ways. Option C would obviously represent what the most likely outcome would be. But options A and E are also legal because those don't break any of the rules that I just discussed earlier about how this damage can get partitioned up. Okay, next question. Nick controls a Gaia's Anthem and a Lumberknot that has 2 +1/+1 counters on it. Amy plays a clone and she wants it to enter the battlefield as a copy of Lumberknot. What will be the power and toughness of clone while it is on the battlefield? And so, first of all, it is possible to clone a Lumberknot. Clone does not use the word target, and that is what Hexproof says you cannot do. So clone is not trying to do the thing that we can't do, so therefore it works perfectly normally. The other important thing to note is that if you have a copy effect, that does not copy any counters that are on the creature that you're copying, and it also does not copy any other types of continuous effects that are acting on the creature that you're copying. So the clone will not have any of the buffs that the Lumberknot has. It will just be a 1/1. It will, of course, have the Lumberknot's ability. So if Amy's creatures die, then the clone could get some additional +1/+1 counters that way. But it starts out just being a 1/1. All right, so next up, let's see. Which of these spells is a legal target for Disdainful Stroke? Choose all that apply. And so there's Disdainful Stroke, and then you can see we've got all these spells here, and we have like some notes about the spells. Basically, the notes all say the spell was cast in the most interesting possible way for this question. So we'll just go straight through down the line here. With Force of Will, the mana value of a spell is based on these symbols that you see up in the top right here, and that is true whether you cast it normally or whether you alt cast it. So Force of Will, regardless of how you've cast it, it will have a mana value of 5, so we are always able to Disdainful Stroke the Force of Will. Likewise with the Supreme Verdict, it does have a mana value of 4, and it is a spell. So that is the only criteria that Disdainful Stroke says on the target. So therefore, Supreme Verdict is also a valid choice. Of course, probably not a great choice due to the fact that it cannot be countered, but that is still possible to play the Disdainful Stroke trying to counter the Supreme Verdict. It just won't do anything when the Disdainful Stroke resolves. But hey, maybe you need like an extra prowess trigger or something. Chalice of the Void, we've got X equals 3. Now, anywhere except the stack, the X is equal to 0. But on the stack, the X is counted by the game as whatever number that we picked for it. So if we cast a Chalice of the Void with X equals 3, then that would mean that the mana value of that spell would be 6, 3, and then plus 3 for the other one. And so that would, in fact, be a 4 or greater, so we'd be good there. Voice of Reason, protection from blue, does not function while the spell is on the stack. It only functions when it's on the battlefield. And so that means that Voice of Reason is perfectly valid hit as well, and Disdainful Stroke will counter it. And finally, we have Mouth to Feed. And so with this spell, we said that Mouth is the half that we're casting. And with that being the case, the spell on the stack only has the characteristics of whichever half that you have cast. So as a result, that means that our mana value will be considered to be 3 for that spell. So not valid. So any of these ones, but not Mouth. Alright, so let's see what we got next. Amy attacks with a Grizzly Bears that is enchanted with Divine Transformation. Grizzly Bears is blocked by Bonebreaker Giant, which is just a vanilla 4/4 that's red. After combat, Amy equips Sword of War and Peace to Grizzly Bears. Which of these best describes what happens after the equip ability resolves? So, with this question here, we're going to go through step by step. And this is one of those things, most people would probably get the answer right, I feel, to this one, if they were just asked what actually happens. But understanding exactly why it happens is very important too. And there will be a lot of questions that have the same answer, the same like result, but they'll have like a few different ways that result could get arrived at. So, okay. First thing that we're going to see happen is the game is going to check for state-based actions, and there's going to be something very interesting because there is a white enchantment that is enchanting a creature with protection from white. And so after that check, the game is going to put the Divine Transformation into Amy's graveyard. Okay, after that, the Grizzly Bears is going to be a 4/4 because it will no longer be getting +3/+3. And so the game will check for state-based actions again after the first state-based action check. And during the second state-based action check, the game is going to see that there's a 4/4 creature with 4 damage on it. Now, it is true that it has protection from red and the damage was from a red source, but the way that protection saves you from red damage is it says that any red damage that would be dealt to you is going to get prevented. Now, the red damage that's on the Grizzly Bears already, it didn't have protection from red at the time when that damage was getting dealt, so that damage won't get prevented. And once it's dealt, it's on the Grizzly Bears. The protection's not going to be able to save you from dying due to the fact that you have red damage on it. So that does correspond to answer choice number A, and that is the reason why that would be the case. All right, so now we've got Saheeli's Artistry with the second mode, and we're targeting Nick's Abzan Kinguard, which has a +1/+1 counter on it. Amy does not control any white or black permanents, but Nick does. Which of these statements are true about the characteristics of the token on the battlefield? Choose all that apply. Alright, so the token's mana cost is 3 and a green, and the reason for that is because when you copy something, one of the things that gets copied would in fact be the mana cost. So we are copying the mana cost, and so we have the exact same mana cost on the token. The token is green, and that's because the color is ordinarily determined based on the mana cost. And since we did copy the mana cost, we are also copying the color of the thing as well. The token is an artifact creature, so that is in fact what Saheeli's Artistry means when it says it's an artifact in addition to its other types. So it's a creature, and it's an artifact, so it is an artifact creature. So we're good there. The token has lifelink. Okay, so with this one, Abzan Kinguard has lifelink as long as you control a white or a black permanent. So Nick does control a white or black permanent, so the Abzan Kinguard will have lifelink on his side. But Amy does not have a white or black permanent. So Amy's Abzan Kinguard token will have this ability, but Amy does not have any white or black permanents to activate that ability. Activate maybe being a bad word because that's refers to a different kind of ability. But the ability will not be working because Amy does not have a white or black permanent. And that is the source that lifelink has. That is the source of the lifelink ability on Abzan Kinguard. So therefore, the token will not have lifelink. And the token is 4/4. That is also false because even though this had a counter on it, we do not copy those sorts of things. We do not copy counters. when we are copying an object. And so that means that we are only going to have these first three attributes. All right, next up. Nick controls Symbiotic Elf and Elvish Archdruid. Amy plays a Pyroclasm. Which of these best describes what happens after Pyroclasm resolves? All right, so Pyroclasm is going to deal 2 damage to everything. And we'll notice that at the time when Pyroclasm is resolving, Elvish Archdruid is a 2/2, but Symbiotic Elf is a 3/3 because it is an elf. Therefore, it's getting +1/+1. So, with that being the case, the state-based actions check that happens after Pyroclasm resolves, we'll see the Elvish Archdruid being lethal damage, but the Symbiotic Elf will not be lethally damaged. And so with that being the case, the Elvish Archdruid will be destroyed, but the Symbiotic Elf will stick around. Of course, after that happens, the game is going to check to see if there's any state-based actions that need to be performed. And at that point, the Symbiotic Elf will no longer be getting +1/+1. So it will now be getting destroyed because it is a 2/2 with 2 damage on it. And only after the Symbiotic Elf gets destroyed is its triggered ability going to trigger and give Nick the 2 insect tokens. So that corresponds to answer choice A. Okay, so with this question here, Amy attacks with a hill giant. Nick blocks with 2 grizzly bears. Which of these best describes what happens next? Now, I do personally consider this kind of an unfair question, in that like it's really more of a trivia kind of a question than a like understanding how stuff works question. But questions like this definitely can show up on judge exams. So I think it's important to get some exposure to this sort of thing too. So the important thing to know to be able to answer this question is that when you are in combat, there is a specific time when you have to say which grizzly bears is going to be the first one that takes damage from hill giant. That actually does happen during the declare blockers step. That's called declaring a damage assignment order. If that's the technical term for that. And then after that, the next thing that would happen would be for the damage to actually get dealt, which happens during the combat damage step. Other important fact that's key to this question is there is no such thing as the damage assignment step. That is a fictitious step, does not exist. And so if you see any answer choices that reference the damage assignment step, then you could cross them out immediately because there is no such step. So this is answer choice A would be the one that corresponds to what we had just said. All right, so Amy casts a lightning bolt against Nick's drudge skeletons. In response, Nick activates the activated ability. Which of these best describes what happens when lightning bolt resolves? Okay, so for this one, it's just a plain and simple question about do you know how regenerate works? So what regenerate does, as you can helpfully see in the flavor text for this one, I was nice and I gave you a version of drudge skeletons that has reminder text. Not all of the versions of Judge Skeletons have reminder text, so that's something that you want to, probably not rely on. If you forget how this works, you should probably look it up. It's in the Comprehensive Rules section 702 is where all the keyword abilities are defined. So the Lightning Bolt does 3 damage to the Drudge Skeletons. That's because that's what it says on Lightning Bolt. Lightning Bolt does not try to destroy Drudge Skeletons. The state-based actions are going to destroy Drudge Skeletons because it has 3 damage on it, not Lightning Bolt. However, the Drudge Skeleton's regeneration shield is going to kick in. Now, a common misconception about regenerate is that it returns the creature to the battlefield. That is, in fact, not how regenerate works. A creature that regenerates never leaves the battlefield, and it does not re-enter the battlefield. So any options that reference that sort of behavior are going to be wrong. The way that Regenerate deals with the fact that the Drudge Skeleton has damage on it is the damage gets removed. And also, Regeneration involves tapping the creature and removing it from combat if it's in combat. So if you put all of that together, then you're going to end up with answer choice C here. All right. Which of the following cards have mana abilities? Choose all that apply. Now, an activated ability is considered to be a mana ability if it meets 3 criteria. It has to directly add, or at least be capable of directly adding, mana to a player's mana pool. Now that is not something that this activated ability does, so this is not a mana ability. It has to not have any targets, so that means that we are not going to have this one be a mana ability either. All these abilities have targets. And it cannot be a loyalty ability of a planeswalker, so this one is also out. Okay, so that means that this activated ability was able to meet all of the criteria. Let's notice that it is possible that activating this ability will yield 0 mana, but we don't need to be guaranteed to add mana to the player's mana pool. We just need to have the possibility of that happening, and we certainly do have that here. Let's also note that there's a timing restriction this ability has. Makes no difference at all. The answer is exactly the same. So this is a mana ability. Now a triggered ability is a mana ability if it has the same sort of criteria. It can't have a target, and it also has to trigger off of mana being added to your mana pool in some way. There's a more technical definition in the comprehensive rules, but that's the gist of it. It has to be mana being added to your mana pool in some way. And it also does have to potentially add mana to your mana pool. So this and this are both mana abilities. Alright, next up, Amy is going to attack Nick's Gideon Jura with a Duskdale Worm. Nick blocks with Zombie Outlander. Gideon has 4 loyalty counters on it. Which of these best describes how Amy can assign Duskdale Worm's combat damage? Now, Duskdale Worm has Trample. Okay, so with Trample, you have to assign lethal damage to all of the blocking creatures. And after you have done that, you can assign any of the excess damage to the defending player or the defending planeswalker. So a couple of interesting points about that. The game, when it's deciding what lethal damage is, it's not going to consider any abilities that would prevent the damage, such as protection. And so that means that the Duskdale Worm only needs to assign 2 damage to the Zombie Outlander before it can start assigning damage to Gideon Jura. Now, it is legal for you to assign additional damage to the Zombie Outlander if you wanted to, because Trample is optional in that case. But what is not legal would be for you to assign damage to the player after the Planeswalker has taken lethal damage. There's a special extra kind of Trample that's called Trample over Planeswalkers, that lets you do that. But of course, Duskdale Worm has not got this special kind of Trample. So putting that together, we are left with answer choice C that describes what I've just talked about there. Okay, good. Amy casts a Cloud Shift on her Thragtusk. Which of these best describes what happens during and following the process of its resolution? Okay, so when we cast a spell, what happens is that we do all of the instructions in the order that they're written down, and then we put the spell into its owner's graveyard as the last step of its resolution. Okay, so we're going to exile the Thragtusk and then put it back onto the battlefield, and then after that we're going to put Cloud Shift into the graveyard. Now, triggered abilities can trigger during the process of a spell resolving, but they do not get put onto the stack until the next time a player would get priority, which happens after the entire process of the spell resolving has been completed. So that means that the Thragtusk triggered abilities are both going to trigger during the resolution of Cloud Shift. However, we are not going to put them on the stack until after the Cloud Shift has been put into Amy's graveyard. Okay, so with that being the case, we're still left with what order do we put them onto the stack? And the answer to that question is that if a player has multiple triggered abilities that have triggered since the last time that we got to put triggered abilities on the stack, then that player chooses the order that they are put onto the stack. And that order that they choose may or may not conform to what order they actually physically triggered in. So that would be, putting all that together, we get answer choice A. That is the answer choice that has all of the facets that I've just explained now. All right, now, Amy is casting Splitting Headache. Which of these best describes when she makes the choices associated with this spell? Okay, so with this, it is a modal spell. You can tell because it says choose one. The modes and the targets are both things that happen as you're casting the spell. You would make those choices at the time when you're casting Splitting Headache. The modes are chosen before the targets. That's not obvious from this spell here because both of the modes have the same kind of target, and that's why I chose Splitting Headache for this example. But it is certainly not guaranteed that that can happen. And that's an easy way that you can remember that the modes happen before the targets, because there are many examples of spells where if you choose a different mode, then that changes what type of targets you can have or the number of targets that are available. So that is the answer to that question there. Okay, so now we've got Trinisphere. Oh man, everybody's favorite card. So there's 9 creatures on the battlefield, Trinisphere and Sphere of Resistance. Also, what does Amy have to pay to cast Blasphemous Act? So the way that we determine the cost to cast the spell is we start with what the cost is, and then we add any cost adders, such as Sphere of Resistance, so now we're up to 9 into red. And then we apply any cost reducers, so it costs 9 less to cast because there's 9 creatures on the battlefield. And then we apply Trinisphere, which applies last in its own special extra layer. So the final answer is 2 and a red. Okay, good. Amy casts a fodder launch, targeting Nick's Grizzly Bears. In response, Nick activates Bizarre Trader, targeting Grizzly Bears. What happens? Okay, so for this one here, let's take a look at the fodder launch, and we'll notice a couple of interesting points. Number 1 is it says target creature. Gets -5 until end of turn. So that is the only target restriction. It just has to be a creature. So as long as the thing that fodder launch is targeting is still a creature at the time when fodder launch tries to resolve, then it will still have a legal target and it will still be able to resolve. So that's the first part of our answer. It will resolve and it'll deal -5 to the creature just like it normally would. Now, fodder launch also deals 5 damage to that creature's controller. Here's a fun fact. If we want to know what the creature's controller is, the game does that check as the fodder launch is resolving. And so what that means is that because Amy is now the person who controls fodder launch, that means she is the person who's going to be taking 5 damage. So that's kind of an interesting trick that Nick had, and it makes the Bizarre Trader look like he's worth his weight in gold there. All right, next question. In a 2-headed giant game, Amy attacks with Hypnotic Spectre. Neither Nick or Nicole has any flying creatures, so they let the damage through. Who has to discard a card at random, and why? Okay. So with 2-headed giant, this is actually, I think, a question where the answer has changed, throughout Magic's history. The way that it works now is that when you are declaring your creatures as attacking creatures, then you have to specifically say which of the 2 heads that you're attacking with those creatures. And so whichever one of those heads that Amy said that she was going to attack, whether Nick or Nicole, that is the player that has to discard. So that corresponds to answer choice A. Like I said, I believe in previous CRs, the answer might have been different. I believe there was a point in Magic's history where the correct answer would have been B. But if you take a look in the comprehensive rules, I think I want to say it's 805.10a is the one that goes over that specific point of how attacking works in shared team turn option Magic. So that is the answer to this question. Now, another interesting point is that a lot of the time you're going to run into a situation where the players don't say, right? A lot of people either don't know about this rule or it doesn't come up very often, so they forget. So what would happen in a case like that? Well, it turns out there actually is a shortcut. If you look in MTR 4.1, there is one of the shortcuts dedicated to that exact thing, and it says that the default assumption is that the player has chosen to attack the person seated across from them. Like not diagonally from them, but like directly across from them. So you would use that information to determine which player would be the one that has to discard if there were a case like that came up. Not related to the not related to the question that's written down there, but certainly an interesting fact to know. And it is kind of, allied to it, I suppose. Okay, and the last of our rules-based questions we have here. In a two-headed giant game, Amy controls Zulaport Cutthroat, and Adam controls 3 creatures. Amy casts Damnation, which destroys all 4 creatures. How much life does each team gain or lose? Okay, so let's first take a look at Zulaport Cutthroat, and it says whenever Zulaport Cutthroat or another creature you control dies. So here is the important fact number 1, which is that Amy is the only person who Zulaport Cutthroat looks at. There's only one you. If you have a teammate, then that's fine, but they're not you. They're your teammate. And so as a result, the creatures that Adam has that die, those are not going to generate any Zulaport Cutthroat triggers. We're only going to see one Zulaport Cutthroat trigger, and that's going to be from Zulaport Cutthroat itself dying. Okay, so when that trigger resolves, what's going to happen? Well, each opponent is going to lose 1 life. Now, guess what? In Two-Headed Giant, there's actually 2 opponents, and so that means that each of Nick and Nicole will lose 1 life. So that is them losing 2 life in total. Now, this trigger says that you gain 1 life. It does not say 1 life for each life they lost or something similar to that. And there are other, similar effects that are worded that way. So remember to read the card very carefully. But this one specifically, it only says that you gain 1 life. So that's the correct answer. Is that you would gain 1 life for Amy and Adam, and Nick and Nicole would lose 2 life in total. All right. So now we'll move on. Now we've done 20 rules-based questions, and now we can talk about some of the policy-based questions. So first up, what is the minimum number of players required to hold a sanctioned individual format event? And yes, this is a fair game question. I gotta say, these sorts of things, if you do not know, you can look it up. It is in Magic Tournament Rules section 10.1. Is where they have these sanctioning minimums. And with this being the case, the correct answer is C. A couple of notes about that. First of all is if it is a team format event, and that includes Two-Headed Giant, if it is a team format event, it is actually 4 teams that are required. So it ends up being like the same number of players, right? Because the teams all have 2 or more people on them. But it is only 4 teams that are required if you have a team format event. And another very important consequence of this is that if your RPTQ or if your RCQ does not have 8 people showing up to it, then it does not have enough, and it does not count. It is not an official RCQ without 8 or more people, because that is the minimum number of players required to hold a sanctioned individual format event. So hopefully you would be able to get at least 8 people showing up to one of those, because otherwise it does not count and nobody is going to qualify. But the real like key to this question is knowing where to look this sort of stuff up, and this stuff is in the MTR. It's generally towards the back. Okay, at an F&M, Amy is on the draw, and she mulligans to 6. As she is drawing for her first turn, her sleeves stick together and she accidentally sees the top 2 cards of her library. She calls a judge before putting either card in her hand. What do you do? Now, it's not like explicitly stated here, but I'll go ahead and mention the intent with this question is that, we still know what the 2 cards are, and we still can confirm what order the 2 cards are in relative to what order, they would have been on top of Amy's library. So with this being the case, first of all, we're not issuing a game loss. One of the things with these policy questions is that, like, a lot of the time there's only like a couple answers that really make sense. But anytime you see something saying that you should be giving a game loss at a regular relevant, well, that's probably a red flag. You can generally discount stuff that says stuff like that, or similarly outlandish kind of claims. Now, with that being the case, what would we do? Well, the best thing to do would be to get the extra card and shuffle back in. But it's also important for this second part here. Because Amy mulliganed, we want to leave the bottom card of Amy's deck in the same spot, because Amy knows what the bottom card of her library is supposed to be. She put it there with the mulligan. And so as a result, this would be the like best answer for this case. All right, so now at a game day, Amy taps 4 planes and she casts a Supreme Verdict. After both players put all their creatures into their graveyard, Nick asks, "Hey, wait, how did you cast that?" And the players call for a judge. After talking to them, you believe that Amy made a simple mistake when she was tapping her lands. What do you do? Okay, so this is a common problem that's not addressed elsewhere. I believe that's the trade term that the judging at regular rules enforcement level document uses to refer to errors of this sort. So there are 2 different choices that we have for the fix, and it's up to the judge to decide which one is better. We could leave the game state as is. You could do option A. That would be a policy supported fix, but I would say that because we caught it so quickly, the backing up option would be the better one. And I think that's a pretty clear cut case of a time when you would want to back up. I think most judges would probably agree with that. So that would be the best answer here. Now, the other thing is that when we're backing up, you would back up all of the actions that have already taken place. So with that being the case, you would return the Supreme Verdict to Amy's hand. You would untap the lands that she used to cast it, and then you would return all the creatures that had been put into the graveyard into the battlefield. So that corresponds to this option here, option D, and you're fully backing up. And again, we're not giving people a game loss for stuff like this unless they did it 10 times before in like previous FNM or something. I don't know. It would be pretty unusual situation to consider doing something like that. All right, Amy and Nick are playing in the last round of a pre-release when time is called. Since neither of them is likely to win in the extra turns, Amy proposes rolling a die to decide who the winner will be. Nick calls for a judge to ask if that's legal. After talking to the players, you find that Amy is new to Magic, but she also plays another TCG where such practices are commonplace at the end of the round to prevent a draw, and she just assumed that Magic worked the same way. What do you do? All right, so this is another question where the answer has actually changed throughout Magic's history. There was a time when Amy was getting disqualified for this one here, but because it's clear that Amy did not know what the severity or the seriousness of this sort of issue was, because of that, we are not giving Amy a hard penalty. We're just saying you can't do that, and we certainly would want to make mention of the fact that it's possible that you could get disqualified for making such an offer. So don't do it in the future. Given that Amy does not know it is against the rules, the current policy does not include a disqualification for Amy. So that's good. Okay, and the last one. At an FNM, Amy finds Nick's Grizzly Bears in her library while she's searching. When you talk to the players about this, you find that Amy played a mind control against Grizzly Bears in their last game, and then she must have accidentally put the bear in her graveyard when it was destroyed. So you count both players' libraries, and we find that Amy started this game out with 61 cards, including Nick's bear, so like her 60 cards that she was supposed to be playing plus 1 extra from Nick's deck. And Nick started with 59. What do you do? All right, so the first thing is, this isn't competitive rel, so we're not giving people a game loss for simple mistakes like this. So these two are both going to be out. So we definitely know that we want to remove the Grizzly Bears from Amy's library, obviously. So what are our other options here? Well, we could put it into Nick's sideboard and have the players play more carefully. That fixes Amy's library, but it doesn't fix Nick's library because Nick would still be at 59 cards. Or we could remove the Grizzly Bears and put it into Nick's sideboard, and then we could shuffle a random card from Nick's sideboard back into the random portion of his library. This, this might be like more fair if we thought that Nick was somehow trying to abuse the system by letting this mistake happen. But the better answer would be option C here, which is where we would shuffle the Grizzly Bears into the random portion of Nick's library. That gets us to the game state. I think probably the closest is what we would have seen if there was no mistake. Maybe if Nick was planning on boarding out the Grizzly Bears, then maybe you could say that we should be doing some of these other things. But in general, I would say that most judges, I think, would probably agree that this option would be the best one. And so that is it. That is the level 1 practice exam. I had a lot of fun going through all these. It's one of those things where as like a higher rules knowledge kind of a judge, it's fun to look back on these things and think, oh yeah, I remember learning about this, and oh yeah, this was a really fun question, and getting to pick out questions that I thought really hammered home the details and the intricacies. This was like getting to like go through my judge candidates exams with them was and still is one of my favorite parts of certifying new judges. So that is all I have for you today. How did you do? Join me again next time for another daily ruling. But until then, I hope you have a great day.